You know, people always say you don't truly know someone until you've been tested. Marriage, for the most part, felt like smooth sailing for me. Linda and I were partners, best friends, the kind of couple people would say, "You two are so lucky to have each other." I believed that too, until the cracks began to show. It wasn't some grand event, no earth-shattering moment. It was a text message. That's how it all started. It was one of those regular Thursday evenings, nothing special. I'd just finished mowing the lawn and came into the house, still sweaty, and there was Linda in the kitchen. She was making tea, her usual post-work ritual. I stood there watching her, appreciating the little things, you know? The way she hummed while stirring, her focused expression as if making tea was some delicate science experiment. That's when her phone buzzed. Now, let me be clear. I'm not the snooping type. I'm not one of those paranoid husbands constantly checking my wife's phone. We trusted each other, or so I thought. But something about that moment gave me pause. Maybe it was the way she froze for just a second, the tiniest hesitation before she reached for the phone. Or maybe it was my gut, whispering to me that something wasn't right. Her phone lit up on the counter, and I saw the notification flash across the screen. "Can't wait to see you again." Alpha Alpha. What kind of name is that? At first I thought it was a joke, some work thing I didn't understand. Linda picked up her phone, glanced at the message, and then put it down quickly, her smile a little too forced as she asked, "How is the yard?" The yard? I didn't care about the yard at that moment. My mind was stuck on that message. Alpha? Who the hell signs off like that? But I played it cool. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I just mumbled something about the grass needing more water and moved on. Or at least, I pretended to move on. Inside, I was spiraling. Over the next few days, little things started to stand out. Linda was suddenly more protective of her phone. She'd take it with her everywhere, even to the bathroom. Her schedule got weird. Late nights at work, new gym classes she'd never mentioned before, and this general air of excitement she didn't seem to share with me anymore. I wanted to ignore it, to believe that I was imagining things, but the signs were too clear to overlook. So, I started paying attention. Not obsessively, just enough to notice the patterns. And let me tell you, when your wife starts guarding her phone like it holds the codes to a nuclear bunker, you know something's up. I'd catch glimpses of her texting when she thought I wasn't looking, her face lighting up in a way that had nothing to do with me. It hurt, you know? That kind of silent rejection. Finally, one evening while she was in the shower, I couldn't take it anymore. Her phone was on the nightstand, and I gave in. I know, I shouldn't have done it. But desperation makes you do things you'd never imagine. My hands shook as I scrolled through her messages, and there it was. Alpha. Dozens of texts back and forth. Flirty, intimate, and all too telling. One of them read, "I'm counting down the hours until I see you again." I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. My ears were ringing, my vision blurred. This wasn't some casual misunderstanding. This was an affair, plain and simple. And the worst part? She didn't even try to hide it well. I put the phone back before she returned, my mind racing. What now? Do I confront her? Do I call this alpha guy and demand answers? I didn't know what to do, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Let me tell you, there's nothing quite like finding out the person you've loved and trusted is sneaking around with someone else. It's not just the betrayal. It's the humiliation. I spent days after that discovery just simmering. I'd watch Linda go about her day, laughing at something on her phone, humming while she cooked, and all I could think was, who is she really texting? And why isn't it me? I knew I couldn't just sit there stewing in silence. That wasn't going to fix anything. So I started digging. Not in a crazy stalker way, just enough to figure out who this alpha guy was. And let me tell you, it didn't take long. The breadcrumbs were all there in her messages, subtle hints about where they met, the times they saw each other, Even a picture or two she thought she'd deleted but hadn't. Turns out, Alpha was Ryan. Ryan, the owner of a gym downtown. I checked out his social media, and it was exactly what I expected. Shirtless photos, motivational captions about being a real man, and more protein shakes than any human being should consume in a lifetime. His bio even said something like, "Helping you become the alpha you were born to be." I mean, who talks like that? Anyway, I decided I needed to see this guy in person. Not to confront him, not yet, but just to size him up. So, one Saturday afternoon, I walked into his gym. I didn't tell Linda, of course. She thought I was running errands. In reality, I was walking into a place where everyone looked like they could bench press a small car. And there he was. Ryan. He was exactly what I expected. Picture a guy who spends more time in front of a mirror than with actual people. Muscles bulging, hair gelled back, that fake tan shade that's somewhere between beach bum and orange peel. He was standing by the front desk, laughing with a group of trainers like he was holding court. I didn't approach him right away. Instead, I pretended to browse the gym equipment, blending in as much as I could. But I couldn't take my eyes off him. This was the guy my wife thought was better than me? This cocky, self-absorbed gym bro? I felt anger bubbling up, but I kept it in check. This wasn't the time to lose my cool. Eventually, he noticed me. I guess standing awkwardly near a row of treadmills makes you stand out. He walked over, all swagger and smirks, and said, "Hey man, you looking to join? We've got some great packages." For a second, I thought about lying, pretending to be a potential client just to mess with him. But then I thought, no. Be direct. See how he reacts. So I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Actually, I'm here to talk about Linda." The smirk faltered for just a second. Just a second. Then it came back, bigger than before. "Ah," he said, leaning against a nearby bench press. "You must be her husband." There it was. No denial, no pretending he didn't know who I was. He said it like he was proud of himself, like he wanted me to know. "Yeah," I said, "that's me." The conversation that followed was infuriating, to say the least. He didn't apologize. He didn't even seem embarrassed. Instead, he doubled down on his arrogance, saying things like, "Look, man, it's not personal. Linda's just looking for something you clearly can't give her." Can you believe that? The nerve of this guy. But I didn't let him see me sweat. I stayed calm, even when he tried to intimidate me with his whole alpha male act. He crossed his arms, puffed out his chest, like that was supposed to scare me. "You've got some nerve," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But let me give you a piece of advice. You don't know who you're messing with." He laughed, this loud, obnoxious laugh that made me want to knock that smug grin right off his face. "You? Mess with me? Good luck with that, buddy." I didn't rise to the bait. I just smiled, turned, and walked out. Let him think he'd won. Let him think I was weak. He had no idea what was coming. It's funny how some people mistake calmness for weakness. Ryan was one of those people. Walking out of that gym, I could feel his smug grin burning into the back of my head. I bet he thought I'd left with my tail between my legs, that I'd go home, sulk in a corner, and let him carry on as if nothing had happened. But Ryan didn't know me. Not yet. I spent the next couple of days planning my next move. I didn't want to act out of anger or frustration. No, this had to be calculated. My pride was already bruised, and I wasn't about to let him humiliate me further. If he thought I was going to back down, he was in for a rude awakening. On a Wednesday afternoon, I walked back into that gym. This time, I wasn't there to observe. I was there to send a message. Ryan was standing by the front desk, as expected, surrounded by his little posse of trainers. They laughed at something he said, probably another one of his alpha male quips. And for a moment, I wondered if any of them had the courage to tell him he wasn't nearly as intimidating as he thought. He spotted me almost immediately. His eyes narrowed, but the smirk returned. He sauntered over, clearly enjoying the attention his audience was giving him. Back again? He said, leaning casually against the desk. Didn't think you'd show your face here after last time. Ryan, I said evenly, ignoring his taunt. We need to talk, privately. He raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening. Oh, we do we? What's the matter? Can't handle the competition? The trainers around him chuckled, and I felt my jaw tighten. But I didn't let him get to me. 5 minutes? I said firmly. Or would you rather I air your dirty laundry in front of your clients? That shut him up. The smirk faltered, just slightly. But it was enough. He motioned toward a side office, clearly trying to maintain his air of control. Fine, let's talk. The office was small, cramped, and reeked of stale protein powder. Ryan shut the door behind us and leaned against it, crossing his arms like he was about to lecture a child. All right, buddy, he said. Spill it. I didn't bother sitting down. I'm not here to play games, Ryan. You're messing with my marriage, my life. And I'm here to make it very clear, you don't scare me. He snorted, shaking his head like I'd just told the world's dumbest joke. Look, man, I get it. You're upset. But let's not pretend Linda's happy with you. If she was, she wouldn't be with me. There it was, that arrogant, condescending tone that made my blood boil. But I held my ground. Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night? That stealing another man's wife makes you the better man? He laughed again, this deep, mocking sound that echoed off the walls. Stealing? No one stole anything, pal. Linda came to me. Maybe you should ask yourself, why? I took a step closer, closing the space between us. He didn't move, but I saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Here's the thing, Ryan, I said quietly. You think this is about you and Linda? It's not. This is about respect. And right now, you're crossing a line you can't uncross. Ryan's bravado didn't waver, but I could tell he didn't like the way I was looking at him. Big talk for a guy who looks like he's never stepped foot in a gym. I smiled. A cold, measured smile. You're right, Ryan. I'm not built like you. But here's the difference between us. You think muscles make a man. I know better. You think you're intimidating me right now, but trust me, you're out of your depth. For a moment, he just stared at me, his smirk frozen in place. Then he pushed off the door, puffing out his chest like a rooster. You don't scare me, buddy. I'm the alpha here. Always have been, always will be. I stepped back, giving him space, but my smile didn't fade. You keep telling yourself that. But let me give you some advice. Stay out of my way. You won't like what happens if you don't. With that, I turned and walked out of the office. I could feel his eyes boring into my back, but he didn't say a word. Maybe he thought he'd won. Maybe he thought I was bluffing. Either way, I wasn't done yet. Here's the thing about people like Ryan. They thrive on what they can see. He looked at me and saw a man he thought he could intimidate. I wasn't as bulky as him, didn't have his alpha energy or whatever he liked to call it. To him, I was just some weak, clueless husband. He didn't know what I'd been through, what I was capable of, and I wasn't in any rush to tell him. I've never been one to brag about my past. Not because I'm ashamed of it, far from it. I just don't see the point in flaunting what you've done or what you can do. Actions speak louder than words, right? But sometimes, the quiet ones, the ones who stay in the background, are the ones you should be worried about. You see, long before I became a guy in a polo shirt mowing the lawn on weekends, I was someone else entirely. Back in my 20s, I served in an elite unit in the military. We weren't just regular soldiers. We were trained for situations where failure wasn't an option. Hostage rescues, covert missions, high-stakes negotiations. You name it, I've probably done it. I've seen things that would keep most people up at night, and I've dealt with men far more dangerous than Ryan could ever hope to be. But when I left that life, I left it completely. I wanted something different. something quieter. So I buried that part of me, built a new life with Linda, and never looked back. She didn't know much about my time in the military, and honestly, I liked it that way. The past was the past, and I didn't see the need to drag it into our marriage. But now, standing face to face with a man who thought he could bully me out of my own marriage, I felt that old part of me stirring, the part that knew how to handle situations like this. I wasn't looking for a fight, but I also wasn't going to let him walk all over me. It was time to remind Ryan, and maybe even myself, that I wasn't the type to back down. I started thinking about how to approach this. With someone like Ryan, it wasn't about brute force. That's what he understood, sure. But that wasn't what would really rattle him. No, what would get to him was control, showing him that I wasn't afraid, that I wasn't playing by his rules. That's the thing about guys like him. They hate feeling powerless. And I was going to make sure he felt it. In the days following our confrontation at the gym, I began laying the groundwork. I didn't need to throw a punch or make some dramatic scene. All I had to do was be present. A subtle reminder that I wasn't going anywhere. I started showing up at the gym unannounced, not to talk to him, but just to be there. I'd walk around, chat with the staff, even strike up conversations with a few of the regulars. All the while, I could feel Ryan watching me, trying to figure out what my angle was. And then there were the little things. A comment here, a casual mention of something personal about him that I'd learned through my research. Nothing too obvious, just enough to plant a seed of doubt, enough to make him wonder how much I knew, how far I was willing to go. The more I did, the more his confidence started to crack. It wasn't just about him, though. I was also thinking about Linda. She'd made her choices, sure, but I wasn't about to let her think I was some pushover. At home, I started to subtly remind her of the man she married, not through arguments or ultimatums, but through actions. The way I carried myself, the way I handled things around the house, it was all calculated. If she was going to compare me to Ryan, I wanted her to see the real difference. Ryan might have had muscles, but I had something better. Discipline, focus, and the kind of strength that didn't need to be flaunted. And deep down, I knew Linda could see it too. The question was, would it be enough to change her mind? By the end of that week, Ryan's swagger was noticeably less pronounced. He still tried to act like the big man in front of his crew, but I could see the cracks forming. Every time I showed up, every time I refused to back down, I was chipping away at the image he'd built for himself. He'd underestimated me, and that was his first mistake. His second mistake? Thinking he could intimidate someone who'd faced much worse than him. But he was about to find that out the hard way. The thing about someone like Ryan is that they thrive on perception. His entire world was built around this idea that he was untouchable, the top dog, the alpha in every room he entered. But when you take someone like that and start shaking the foundation of their confidence, piece by piece, they crumble faster than you'd expect. And that's exactly what I intended to do. Now, I wasn't interested in getting physical. Guys like Ryan expect that. They're prepared for it, even welcome it. No, what I wanted was to get into his head, to make him question everything he thought he knew about himself. And let me tell you, there's nothing more satisfying than watching a man like Ryan second-guess his every move. I started small, subtle, just enough to make him uneasy. Every few days I'd swing by the gym, not to confront him but to linger. I'd chat with the staff, nod at other members, and keep an eye on Ryan from across the room. He'd see me, of course. How could he not? I made sure of that. I wanted him to feel my presence like an itch he couldn't scratch. At first, he tried to ignore me, acting like I wasn't worth his time. But I could see it in the way he carried himself. The tighter jaw, the forced smiles, the way his eyes darted around the room when he thought I wasn't looking. He was on edge, and it was only the beginning. Then I turned my attention to his empire, his precious gym. A little research went a long way. Turns out, Ryan wasn't as squeaky clean as he liked to pretend. There were rumors of questionable business practices, whispers of unpaid staff, and some pretty shady dealings with local suppliers. I didn't have to dig too deep to find people who weren't exactly his biggest fans. I started planting seeds of doubt wherever I could. A casual comment to one of his employees about how business seemed slow lately. A friendly conversation with a member about whether Ryan was as reliable as he seemed. Nothing blatant, just enough to get people talking. And they did. Gym goers are a tight-knit community, and once a rumor starts, it spreads like wildfire. Within a week, I could see the cracks widening. Ryan's once loyal staff began to question him. Members started whispering behind his back. Even his social media posts, those endless shirtless selfies and motivational quotes, began to get comments like, "What's really going on at your gym?" and "I heard some things about you, Ryan." He tried to act like it didn't bother him, but it was clear he was unraveling. His once cocky demeanor turned defensive, and he started snapping at his staff for the smallest mistakes. He was losing control, and I wasn't done yet. At home, things were shifting too. Linda noticed the change in me. I wasn't angry or confrontational, just calm, focused. I started showing her the man she married, the one who knew how to handle things with quiet confidence. I didn't bring up Ryan, didn't accuse her of anything. Instead, I let my actions speak. When something needed fixing around the house, I did it without being asked. When she looked stressed, I offered support without judgment. Slowly but surely, I could see her starting to remember why she fell in love with me in the first place. But Ryan? Oh, he wasn't handling things nearly as well. One evening, he called Linda, probably looking for some reassurance that he was still in control. I didn't hear the whole conversation, but I caught the tail end. Linda's tone was different this time, hesitant. She wasn't laughing at his jokes or feeding his ego. When she hung up, she sat quietly for a moment, lost in thought. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She looked at me, her expression conflicted. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind." I didn't press her. I didn't need to. Ryan's grip on her was slipping, and he knew it. The more I chipped away at his confidence, the more he realized he couldn't hold on to her, or the image he'd built of himself. The best part? He had no idea how far I was willing to go. He thought he was still playing a game he could win. But what Ryan didn't realize was that the game was over the moment I decided to fight back. It's funny how clarity sneaks up on you. For weeks, I'd been walking a tightrope between keeping my cool and wanting to shout my frustration to the world. But something shifted during those days of quiet warfare. Something in Linda. And as much as I hated what had brought us to this point, I knew it was time to remind her who I was. Who we were. The thing about Linda is that she's always been someone who craves excitement. She loves the highs, the rush of something new, the feeling of being swept off her feet. I knew that about her when I married her, and for years, I tried to be that excitement for her. But life happens, doesn't it? Careers, bills, routines, they have a way of dulling the spark. And somewhere along the way, I think she started looking for it elsewhere. At first, I was angry, furious really. How could she throw away everything we'd built? How could she look at Ryan and see anything other than a shallow, self-obsessed caricature of a man? But then I realized something. Linda wasn't seeing Ryan for who he was. She was seeing him for who she wanted him to be. And my job wasn't to fight him for her attention. My job was to remind her who I was. It started small. Instead of letting her brush me off with vague excuses about work or gym classes, I began engaging with her. "How was your day?" I'd ask, genuinely interested. At first, she gave me those clipped, distracted answers, but over time, she started opening up. She'd tell me about her frustrations at work, the stress of juggling everything, and I listened. Really listened. I also stepped up in ways she didn't expect. That leaky faucet she'd been nagging me about? Fixed. The date nights we'd been too busy for? I started planning them. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet dinner at her favorite restaurant or a movie night at home. But the effort mattered. She noticed. And then there were the moments when I let her see my strength. Not the loud, in-your-face kind that Ryan loved to flaunt, but the steady, unshakable kind. When she vented about a tough day, I didn't try to fix it or minimize her feelings. I just sat with her, held her hand, and let her know she wasn't alone. That quiet reassurance seemed to resonate with her in a way that Ryan's bravado never could. Of course, Ryan wasn't going down without a fight. He kept calling, texting, trying to pull her back into his orbit. One night, I overheard her on the phone with him. She sounded hesitant, her voice lacking the enthusiasm I'd heard before. "I don't know, Ryan," she said, her tone unsure. "Things are complicated right now." When she hung up, I didn't say a word. I just looked at her, and she looked back at me, her expression conflicted. "Michael," she said after a long pause, "why are you being so different lately?" I smiled, keeping my tone light. "Different how?" "I don't know," she said, running a hand through her hair. "You're just here. You're present in a way you haven't been in a long time." I wanted to tell her that I'd always been present, that she was the one who drifted away. But I didn't. This wasn't the time for blame. "I've been thinking a lot," I said instead, "about us, about what we mean to each other. And I realized something. I don't want to lose you, Linda. Not to anyone, but especially not to someone who doesn't see the amazing woman you are." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the crack in her armor. For the first time in weeks, I saw the woman I'd married, the woman I still loved. And I knew I was getting through to her. From that moment on, things began to shift. Ryan's calls became less frequent, and when they did come, Linda's responses grew colder. She stopped sneaking off to her gym classes and started spending more time at home. We weren't back to where we'd been before all this started, but we were moving in the right direction. Still, I knew this wasn't over. Ryan wasn't the type to let go easily, and Linda wasn't the type to make clean breaks. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we had a fighting chance. And I wasn't going to let anyone or anything take that away from us. If there's one thing I learned about Ryan during this entire ordeal, it's that he hated losing. The man had built his entire personality around being the best, and the idea of being outmaneuvered, especially by me, was more than his ego could handle. But the cracks were starting to show. I could see it every time I caught him sneaking glances at me during my visits to the gym, or when I heard Linda brushing off his calls with barely concealed irritation. But Ryan wasn't one to walk away quietly. No, he decided it was time to escalate things. His desperation was almost palpable, and the way he went about it? Pure chaos. It started with a phone call, this time, to me. It was late, close to midnight, when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Linda was asleep, and I almost didn't answer. But curiosity got the better of me. When I picked up, I didn't even get a chance to say hello before his voice cut through the line. "Listen, buddy, we need to talk," he said, his tone dripping with fake authority. Man to man. I stayed silent for a moment, letting his words hang in the air. "Ryan," I said finally, keeping my voice calm, "what do you want?" "What do I want?" he repeated, laughing bitterly. "I want you to stop playing games. You think showing up at my gym and acting like you've got everything under control is going to change anything? Linda's already made her choice. You're just too blind to see it." I leaned back against the headboard, letting his words wash over me. "Is that so?" I said evenly. "You're wasting your time," he continued, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "She's not staying with you. She's with me because I give her what you can't. You're just a placeholder, man. That's all you'll ever be." I couldn't help but smile at the irony. "And yet, here you are," I said, "calling me in the middle of the night because you're so confident you've won." That hit a nerve. His tone shifted, becoming more aggressive. You think you're smart, don't you? Walking around like you're untouchable. But let me tell you something. You don't scare me. I've dealt with guys like you before. You're all talk. The old me, the one who used to handle problems with precision and efficiency, wanted to laugh. Ryan had no idea who he was dealing with. But I kept my composure. Is that all, Ryan? Because if it is, I've got better things to do. You think this is over? He spat. It's not. You're going to regret trying to mess with me. I hung up before he could say more. I wasn't interested in his bluster, but I'll admit, the call left a sour taste in my mouth. Ryan was spiraling, and desperate men do stupid things. I knew it was only a matter of time before he tried something more drastic. The next day, he proved me right. Linda and I were having dinner, something simple, just the two of us, when there was a knock at the door. She glanced at me, confused. Are you expecting anyone? She asked. No, I said, standing up. My stomach tightened as I walked to the door. When I opened it, there he was. Ryan, standing on my porch like he had every right to be there. What are you doing here? I asked, stepping outside and closing the door behind me. I didn't want Linda to hear whatever nonsense he was about to spew. I'm here to settle this, he said, his chest puffed out like a rooster in a fight. You've been screwing with my life, and I'm not going to take it anymore. Ryan, I said, keeping my tone measured, you're on my property. You might want to rethink whatever it is you're about to do. Oh, I've thought about it, he snapped. You think you can just walk into my gym, mess with my reputation, and get away with it? You think Linda's going to pick you over me? Keep dreaming, pal. He took a step closer, trying to intimidate me. I didn't flinch. Let me make something clear, I said, my voice low. This isn't your game to win. You've already lost. Linda's starting to see who you really are, a scared little boy pretending to be a man. And if you think showing up here is going to change that, you're more delusional than I thought. That set him off. He lunged at me, fists clenched, but I was ready. Before he could even get close, I sidestepped and grabbed his arm, twisting it just enough to stop him in his tracks. He froze, his face contorting in pain. You really don't want to do this, I said calmly, my grip firm. Walk away, Ryan. This is your last chance. For a moment, I thought he might push further, but the look in his eyes told me he knew he was outmatched. I let go, and he stumbled back, glaring at me. This isn't over, he muttered before storming off. As I watched him leave, I felt a strange sense of relief. Ryan was desperate, yes, but now he knew this wasn't a fight he could win. Desperation makes people reckless, and Ryan was no exception. After his little stunt on my porch, I expected him to back off, to realize he was in over his head. But Ryan wasn't just desperate. He was delusional. And when people like him feel cornered, they lash out. It started with small things. A few strange calls to my phone where no one spoke, just heavy breathing on the other end. A couple of times, I thought I saw his car parked near my house late at night, but when I stepped outside, it was gone. Subtle intimidation tactics, the kind you'd expect from a man with more ego than brains. I ignored it at first, hoping he'd burn himself out. But Ryan didn't know when to quit. One Friday evening, Linda and I were in the living room. She was flipping through a magazine, and I was reading a book when there was another knock at the door. My stomach tightened. It was too late for a casual visitor. I stood up, and Linda glanced at me, her brow furrowed. Who could that be? She asked. I'll handle it, I said, already knowing who it was. Sure enough, when I opened the door, there he was, Ryan. But this time, he didn't come alone. Two men stood behind him, both built like linebackers, their arms crossed over their chests. Ryan was smirking, but it was a forced smirk, the kind you wear when you're trying to mask fear. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. Ryan, I said, my voice steady, you're trespassing. Again. He scoffed. You think I care about that? I told you this wasn't over. And you brought backup, I said, glancing at the two men. What's the plan here, Ryan? You really think this is going to end well for you? One of the guys behind him stepped forward, clearly trying to intimidate me. We're here to settle things, he said gruffly. Ryan doesn't need this drama. I couldn't help but chuckle. Drama? Is that what he calls sleeping with another man's wife and showing up uninvited at his house? Ryan's face twisted in anger. You think you're so tough, don't you? Always so calm, so collected. Let's see how calm you are when it's 3 against 1. For a moment, I just stood there, letting his words hang in the air. Then, slowly, I stepped closer, closing the distance between us. Ryan, I said quietly, you've made a lot of mistakes, but this is the biggest one yet. Before he could react, I moved. Years of training kicked in like muscle memory. I stepped to the side, grabbing the wrist of the guy closest to me and twisting it behind his back. He yelped in pain as I used him as a shield, blocking the other man's attempt to swing at me. In 2 swift moves, I disarmed them both, figuratively and literally. Ryan froze, his eyes wide as he realized he was the only one left standing. You don't know who you're messing with, he stammered, but the bravado was gone. I let the 2 goons stumble back, nursing their bruises. Then I turned to Ryan, my expression calm. No, Ryan, I said, stepping closer. You don't know who you're messing with. You think you're some big bad alpha, but the truth is, you're just a scared little boy hiding behind muscles and empty threats. He took a step back, and I saw the fear in his eyes. He wasn't expecting this. He wasn't expecting me. This isn't over, he muttered, but it was a weak protest, and we both knew it. Yes, it is, I said firmly. Because the next time you show up here, the cops will be waiting for you. And trust me, Ryan, I'll make sure they know everything. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing heavily, his fists clenching and unclenching. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his 2 lackeys trailing behind him. I watched them leave, standing there until their car disappeared down the street. When I stepped back inside, Linda was waiting for me, her face pale. What was that about? She asked, her voice trembling. Just Ryan being Ryan, I said, brushing it off. It's handled. But it wasn't just handled. It was over. Ryan had tried to intimidate me, to prove he was the alpha, and he'd failed spectacularly. He'd lost the fight, not just with me, but with himself. And as much as I wanted to hate him, I couldn't help but feel a small flicker of pity. He'd built his entire identity around being untouchable, and now he was exposed for what he really was. A fraud. I turned to Linda, meeting her gaze. I told you, I said gently. I'd do whatever it takes to protect what's ours. For the first time in weeks, she didn't look conflicted or distant. She looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. And in that moment, I knew the storm was finally over. In the days following Ryan's meltdown on my front porch, the air in our house felt different, quieter, heavier. Linda and I weren't avoiding each other exactly, but there was this unspoken tension between us. She hadn't brought up what happened, and I wasn't about to force the conversation. I knew she was processing everything, and honestly, so was I. But something told me that a decision was brewing, one that would either bring us back together or pull us apart for good. One evening, a few days after the confrontation, Linda finally spoke up. We were sitting at the dinner table, picking at our plates in silence. She cleared her throat, and I looked up to see her staring at me, her expression unreadable. Michael, she began, her voice soft but steady. We need to talk. I nodded, setting down my fork. I'm listening. She hesitated, looking down at her hands, which were fidgeting nervously. I've been doing a lot of thinking, she said finally, about us, about everything that's happened, and about Ryan. There it was, his name, hanging in the air between us like a storm cloud. I didn't react, didn't interrupt. I just let her continue. At first, she said, her voice trembling slightly, I thought Ryan was everything I wanted. He was exciting, confident, larger than life. He made me feel noticed, in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. She glanced up at me, her eyes searching mine. But after everything that's happened, I've realized something. What's that? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Her lips pressed together, and for a moment she looked on the verge of tears. He's not who I thought he was. None of it was real. It was all about him, his ego, his need to feel powerful, and I let myself get caught up in it because I thought it was what I needed. I stayed quiet, letting her find her words. But you, she continued, her voice breaking slightly, you've been here the whole time. You've been steady, strong, even when I didn't deserve it. And seeing the way you handled everything with Ryan, it reminded me of the man I fell in love with. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, not because they hurt, but because they carried a weight I hadn't felt from her in a long time. Linda, I began, but she held up a hand, stopping me. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she said quickly. I know I hurt you, and I don't expect everything to just go back to the way it was. But I need you to know that I'm done with Ryan. Completely. He called me yesterday, and I told him never to contact me again. The relief that washed over me was immediate, but I kept my expression measured. And what do you want now? I asked carefully. I want us, she said simply. I want to rebuild what we had, if you're willing to try. For a long moment, I just looked at her, my emotions a swirling mix of anger, sadness, and something else. Hope, maybe. Linda, I said finally, this isn't going to be easy. Trust doesn't come back overnight. I know, she said, her voice small, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn it back. I just need to know if you're willing to give me that chance. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. Part of me wanted to say no, to tell her that she'd made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. But the truth was, I still loved her. Despite everything, I wanted to believe we could find our way back to each other. I'm willing to try, I said finally, my voice steady. But you're right, it won't be easy, and it has to be both of us working at this, not just me. She nodded quickly, her eyes brimming with tears. I understand, and I'm all in, Michael. I promise. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, we sat together on the couch, talking. Really talking. We didn't fix everything in one night, far from it. But it was a start. And for the first time, I felt like we had a shot at making it through. As for Ryan, I hadn't heard from him since our showdown, and I hoped it stayed that way. He'd been a storm that swept through our lives, leaving chaos in his wake. But now, the skies were beginning to clear. And as Linda and I sat there, rebuilding the foundation we'd nearly lost, I realized something. Sometimes, it's the hardest battles that remind you what's worth fighting for.